How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak. Hey everyone, welcome to How I Got Here, Mozio and PhocusWire's weekly podcast about innovation in travel and transportation. I'm David Litwak, and I'm joined by Kevin May. And today we're honored to welcome Sebastian Gomez. Sebastian is a co-founder, president, and COO of Reservamos. Reservamos is a multimodal travel booking platform based in Mexico that started as a bus aggregator in 2013, right out of MIT Sloan. Welcome, Sebastian.
David, Kevin, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So we'd like to start every one of these interviews off with the same question, which is for you to tell us in a few minutes, the summary of how you got here.
Great. So to put it in context, first of all, I'm from Colombia. I've been living abroad from Colombia like over 16 years. Moved to the US initially to do my undergrad and worked a bit in New York, then to do my MBA at MIT in Boston. And while I was at MIT, I met Andres, my co-founder, and really it was a bit of luck that we ended up in the travel space. I think because of all the ecosystem of innovation in the university, we started participating in what was the MIT 100K competition. And by that time, we had been living in the US for a period of time, and we said, look, let's look at opportunities for building a business in Latin America. And so we initially started looking into the travel space, because if you would look at all of the commerce dollars that were sold in Latin America at that point in time, that was around 2011, 2012, 50% of it was related to travel business, and mainly it was airlines and hotels. But to our surprise, ground transportation was not digital at all. And so we started investigating the market, the industry, and came across Redbus, which is one of the bus leading players worldwide, based in India. And it really served as inspiration for us. And so fast forward, we launched the company right after finishing our MBA in 2013. And today, we have both a B2C business, which is Reservamos.mx, and a B2B business where we provide enterprise software to mainly bus companies in the region, in Mexico, and expanding to Latin America.
Very cool. So Sebastian and I have known each other for several years, and I feel like every time we meet up, often at a PhocusWire conference or so, you have interesting stories about your supply problems in a country where there's huge monopolies with the various bus companies. So do you think you could chat a little bit more about how tell us more about the ups and downs from how you ended up from B2C to B2B, and the issues that you came in contact with these bus companies?
Yeah, so to give you some context, we launched initially as a B2C play, where what we really identified is that less than 5% of all the bus bookings in Latin America were online, and pretty much the user experience, we saw it had to be very similar to booking an airline ticket. And by that time, when we were thinking of the business model, I spent 10 years in the US, and out of those 6 years, I was a student. So I really traveled by bus very frequently. And I remember that I would go into any of the portals of Megabus or Boltbus, and I would purchase my ticket, and I would receive an SMS. And with that SMS, I was able to board. And so when I moved to Mexico, in 2012 to do an internship. I was here with Andres for leisure one week, and we took a bus to go from Mexico City to San Miguel de Allende, which is one of the most touristy destinations here, and it's mainly accessible through road. The experience was really offline. Getting information of schedules was almost impossible. Booking was almost impossible, and really that was one of the sources of inspiration of building this business, because immediately we realized that bus passengers were 3 times the number of passengers in Latin America. Just to put it in perspective, I think many people in Latin America don't know, but we estimate there's almost like, and in general, like 720 million bus passengers per year, compared to 265 million airline passengers per year in Latin America. And so when we started with that B2C play, we started having conversations with the most important bus carriers in Mexico, which is the country that we launched. At that time, most of those companies did not have an online strategy. And when I say not an online strategy, they didn't even have web services enabled, like to be able to connect with us and be able to distribute through our portal. So it was pretty interesting and difficult conversations, but we were able to sign a few of the players, and when I mean a few, like we were able to get probably like good coverage in top routes such as Mexico City to Guadalajara, to be able to start testing the business model. And in that year, in 2014, I remember we were growing really fast, like 90% month over month. And the reality of this, why it was happening, is we had a really good user interface, we had good technology, and people were ready to buy bus tickets online, but bus companies had not offered that service before. And so this was a huge surprise for a lot of the carriers that we were working with. And many of their commercial teams were extremely happy. But then in 2015, we started to get some mixed signals from the bus carriers that we were working with, because we were getting signals that a lot of the owners of these companies were not really happy with the growth that we were having. And the reality was that we were hitting directly their P&L, because we were charging a commission for distribution. And since these companies relied like heavily on their own distribution channel for sales, they ultimately decided by the end of 2015 to cut all of our commercial contracts with us and with our competitors. And so this was a really aha moment, because we lost almost 80% of our supply, and it became a really it was kind of one of those experiences where you learn a bunch, but we had to renegotiate heavily with all these carriers in a very short amount of time.
Sebastian, it's Kevin here. Welcome to How I Got Here. Thanks ever so much. It's interesting that you encountered those problems within a fairly short space of time. When you were thinking about creating the business, 2013, 2014, did you anticipate at all that you would face those kind of problems with the supply end? And if you did, had you already kind of mitigated for that, or was it all very much a surprise how much kind of kickback you got?
Like I think at that point in time, we did not understand that the industry like thoroughly enough, and why it's because we did in our market research, we identified over 120 bus companies in Mexico, but amongst those, like there were controlled by many of them were controlled by the same group of investors, and so we had commercial contracts with each of them, but we didn't anticipate that this was going to happen all at once. And And as we started to learn about the industry, we did see that there was more concentration in terms of supply than than what we had expected initially. And so once we identified that, um, like we could foresee that in the future there would be some commission contraction, um, and that's really ultimately what happened. Um, Many of these companies have local monopolies in a way, where they're like one of probably like the only one or one of two of the carriers serving a specific route. And they know that um, if the traveler wants to travel on their route, many times the traveler will end up in their site or somewhere uh, within their distribution channels. And so their likelihood like to pay high commissions for distribution, as you see in the hotel side, was not going to happen. And that's when we started changing the whole business. In 2016, it's when we really started to identify and understand that problem.
So it's interesting. I mean, we're moving forward quite quickly. I'm kind of curious. Back at the formation stage, there's yourself and there's Adrian and Andres. I mean, how did you decide as three founders that you would, dividing up the responsibilities within the business? Were those things that came very naturally, given that you didn't know what you were perhaps going to be getting into, whether it's from an industry perspective or just the way the economics of it were going to evolve? How did you decide on the roles?
No, so it was fairly easy because all of us came from different backgrounds. Andres came from the finance industry. I was in the consulting industry prior to starting the company, and Adrian in the technology side of the business. And so um, immediately when we met, when I started working with Andres, I think we both shared the passion for creating a business in Latin America. Um, and and immediately when we started to research and come up with the business plan of what Reservamos is today, um, it became really clear on on where and each of us would serve a better role. And so with Andres, we split up a lot of the business functions. Uh, we we both have relationships with our investor base. Both Andres and I are on the board, and then Adrian, we met while we were in MIT. Adrian was already living in Mexico, in Monterrey. He had graduated from the Tec de Monterrey, which is one of the top technical schools in Latam. Um, and so he was going to play the role of creating the whole product and all the technology stack. Um, and so I think that was a key moment because ultimately that really made it much easier to execute the strategy that we would lay out, because everybody would know like where they would add value and where they didn't. And so that made the whole process of those initial years like easier for all the parts. And we what we did is, I think given that neither of us like had a experience in the travel space, what we did is we created a really good advisory team to be able to get kind of a ramp up of all the knowledge required, because we really didn't have any clue of acronyms or whatever it was. And basically what we knew is how to operate and how to focus on a clear objective. And so that led us to, by the end of 2015, close an institutional round of investment led by Thayer Ventures, where Jeff Jackson was the partner who joined their board. And since we've had a really strong relationship with them.
Very cool. I wanted to quickly rewind, talking about these family relationships, and you said something really interesting about how the commercial teams were very happy with you, but the owners were not. And I've dealt with family-owned businesses before where there's often a disjoint where the owner is only marginally involved and kind of sometimes just doesn't like the idea of something more than anything else, and isn't, and makes uneducated decisions or kind of prejudiced decisions. I'm curious, two-part question. How did you find dealing with these big families? I know there's a lot of them in Mexico that own, the bus companies. And how did you bring them back to the table?
Yeah, so it was really interesting, and you've probably heard this in the past. I think doing business in Latin America is challenging, um, and doing business with the industry was challenging not only because of uh, of them being family-owned businesses, but also because of the context of what of how to do business in Latin America. And before that, we had come from the U.S. And even though we grew up in Latin America, I think in Latin America, the component of trust is extremely is key to do business. And I think in that sense, it's more similar to Asia, where business is done based on relationships uh, rather than on a very like strict commercial transaction. Um, and so we had some kind of rough time at the beginning because we were able to explain the value proposition of our B2C play to the commercial teams, and uh, and many of them were young people that were already like getting online, and they would understand our kind of our vision of that all the bus ticketing would move online. But I think from like by that time we didn't develop the relationships enough with the owners of these companies, and so they would just see it as more as a from a financial perspective. It's impacting my business, and 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 they kind of expected that with the growth, if the growth that we had at that time in 2014 and 2015 would continue, like we would ultimately become a very important channel for their distribution of the tickets, which they've never had that experience before. When you compare the bus industry in Latin America, as I said, like over 95% of those tickets are sold by their direct channels. Um, and when and they're kind of afraid of finishing up in a scenario where, like, let's say 50% of those tickets are not sold through their direct channels, as it occurs in the airline industry in the US. And so they took that decision of cutting all those commercial contracts, and it was not only with Reservamos, it happened with all of our competitors at the time. But many of our competitors decided to leave Mexico, and I really, and it was an aha moment for us, because when our competitors decided to leave Mexico, we doubled down in Mexico. We had moved from MIT to start a company here because from our insights, Mexico is the fourth or fifth largest bus market worldwide in terms of passengers, and we knew that the trend that the industry was going to move online was going to happen. And so during that early period of 2016, when we were changing the whole business model, we we pulled kind of the strings and really with the support of our investor base, we were able to reach many of the decision makers in these companies, and had open and frank conversations. And so what we learned is that all of these bus companies were looking to increase kind of their share of market and be able to reach new customers, and that we could serve with our B2C play. But then they were also interested in having a very competitive direct booking channel, such as what in the US would be like a Greyhound.com. And so immediately when we identified that, we said, okay, well, let's start creating enterprise software that we can rent out to these bus companies so that we can accelerate the whole digitization. And that's really what we did. And today I think the company is very strong because I think nobody would argue against the fact that the like if today less than 10% of all the bookings are online, I think it's just a matter of time that they would go to 40-50% as you already have in other emerging markets such as India, and then in Europe it's probably even more advanced. So I think right now with both our B2C and B2B offering, we're in a position where we are very aligned with the interests of the industry, which is to grow the sales, reduce costs, and really like be able to innovate and provide better services through online technology.
Very cool. Just as parallels, we've heard a couple of our other podcast guests, specifically Silver Rail and Philippe Charique from Amadeus and Amex JBT talk about when they were building systems for distribution in rail and in air, getting into kind of the airline IT or the rail IT side. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, this sounds like you guys went into the bus IT side and that really helped address the concerns of these bus owners. Is that correct?
Correct. We did go into the bus IT side, and so and so not as I was mentioning, like not many people know about the relevance of the bus industry, and really that has happened in Latin America because of the structure of the market. So in Latin America, air traffic penetration is really low. In Mexico, it's one of the lowest worldwide. So air traffic penetration, for example, flights in terms of flights per capita, in Mexico it's only like 0.7, while in the US it's 2.4. But when you compare that with the bus industry, it's completely the opposite. Mexico and Latam has relied on bus transportation to get almost to any destination, whether it's a city, a town, a port, and there's also no rail as well. So I think we have like the decision that we have made as a company is to double down on the industry and not only have that B2C play where we provide an excellent like distribution channel like to our bus partners, but we also provide all the bus IT side so that these companies can also migrate and do this transition into the online space faster and in a more organized way. And I think for the future, like we will continue to focus in the digitization of this bus traveler.
I wanted to quickly pinpoint something you said there. You said it was 0.7 flights per capita in Mexico, 2.4 flights per capita in the US. That's actually still relatively low numbers. And I remember hearing some stat about trains, and Aaron from Silver Rail may have actually been the one to mention this, but I think they said trainline.com has the average visits per year, something like 22 or 23 versus a normal OTA is, 3 or 4 if you're lucky. And the point that they're making is that more online travel agencies should be focusing on these buses and train trips because they're booked shorter and much more often. And you didn't say what the per capita buses in Mexico were, but I'd be curious if you could share that, or if you have that stat, and if that's a core part of your strategy.
Yeah, so we estimate that in Mexico the per capita on the bus side is almost like 1.75 bus trips per person per year, and that's on kind of the mid to luxury segment. If you include like all the suburban side, like it's way even higher. But I think something that is it's very easy for somebody that does not know the airline in like the bus industry that well to compare it with the airline industry, and David, you probably know it's very different. Like something that we learned throughout 2015 is that bus travel is ultimately extremely local, and so people rely on bus companies that serve like certain regions of the country to do those routes, and if one company like serves like the north part of the of the country, it doesn't necessarily serve the southern part of Mexico, for example. And so what we're seeing kind of with the business model that we currently have of both B2C and B2B is that on the B2C side, we are attracting more of a leisure type of consumer, which is less frequent, which comes to Reservamos and spends more time. It relies a lot on the reviews, on the additional information of like the transparency that you can give that traveler. But then on the white labels and on the B2B side, the customer behaves very differently. It's a customer that just wants speed in the transaction, and something that is very efficient, something that is very intuitive, and because it's very likely that that person that goes to our white label sites does the same route over and over and over again. And so to your point in terms of recurrence, yes, it is a fact. I think that because of what the bus industry like serves for the country, which is connects like the whole infrastructure of like it connects all the cities, connects all of the towns. It serves more of a role of like a public type of transportation rather than kind of a how would I say like rather than just like a transportation where people are like picking different options. I think people just like they get one option and they will use that option like multiple times, whether for commercial or for leisure purposes.
And tell me, Sebastian, it's Kevin here again. I mean, you went through a lot of problems, or maybe problems isn't the right word, but you know, you learned a lot along the way. As the years have gone on and you've had presumably competitors come along, do you think they learned a lot from you and decided to do things in a different way, or have other brands faced similar issues in the same way that you did?
Yeah, I think for sure. Like back in when we were starting our business in 2013, 2014, many people were looking at the bus space because amongst all of the travel kind of categories, bus was one of those big ones that had not gone online. And so you had like many of our competitors started at the same time. You had like BusBud in Canada, you had Wanderoo in the US, and many more also in Latin America. And I think we have all gone through a process of understanding the needs of the industry better. And like some of our competitors have stuck to a B2C play. And I think there's another set of competitors which have also started to provide both B2C and B2B technology. And right now, we are confident of our strategy because as I said, I think it is really aligned to the interest of our customers, where they are looking to via technology, like to be able to provide a better services to their current customer base. But not only that, they also see that because of the bus customer coming online, it also opens a huge possibility of providing additional services, whether it could be like travel services such as hotels or financing opportunities. And that's really where the bus customer is so different to the airline customer. So we run, for example, tons of surveys with our customers, like on a regular basis. And to give you a sense, one of the most like one of the products that they seek that we add as a part of our product offering in our B2C side is consumer financing. It's kind of like a payday loan.
Okay.
And which is very unique because of the customer type that we attract. And this does not happen in the airline side, where it's more like kind of the traditional hotel activities, restaurants, or whatever it is.
So can you just talk us through a little bit about that? I mean, how did you come up with that idea? And it sounds, you know, it's very different to the core part of the business. I mean, it's almost, some might say it's quite a risky endeavor?
Yeah, and it's and no, just to put it clear, it's not something that we have engaged in. No, we have provided some type of financing as through payments of the bus tickets via installments, but we are not providing any payday loans. It's just like
Right.
it's one of those requests that come from our consumer, and I make this point just to differentiate how different of a consumer is the bus customer from the airline customer. It's more of a frugal type of traveler, which travels more because of necessity rather than all that leisure component that the airline industry also has as well.
Okay, so keeping on the the theme of money, I mean, talk to us, Sebastian, about how. I mean, you said you worked with Thayer Ventures. They invested in you. I mean, is it the type of business that has needed a lot of capital at all? I mean, you haven't raised a lot of money, so talk us through about how you've thought about raising capital and how you were going to use it, and whether that's something that, we talked to a lot of brands and they've raised lots of money and continue to raise lots of money. Talk us through your economy, your investment strategy, if you can.
Yeah, yeah. So we did as I said earlier, we did take money from institutional investors. This was led by Thayer, and I think we decided Thayer because of their whole expertise in the industry, and they have really been a very strong partner. And aside from Thayer, we also have a few funds from Mexico, which also have been extremely helpful. Our our whole idea of raising capital was kind of raise the right amount of capital to be able to scale the business and accelerate the two different business units that we have. But the reality is that doing business in Latin America is quite different than you doing it in the US and in Europe. And one of those facts is I think there's more of a need to create a profitable, long-term, sustainable business from the early days. And the reason for that is in Latin America, you have like a less mature market in terms of acquisitions, in terms of exits, in terms of IPOs for like the company, for our type of companies. And so many times like the like that kind of forces kind of the entrepreneur, the companies to really like seek profitability. And so we have completed, we have raised a bit over like $7 million, and right now we're profitable. So we continue to invest in our business, but in a very like sustainable way, supporting both the B2C and the B2B strategies. And right now we have been in the market like speaking to investors, but more defining kind of that strategy of areas of pockets of opportunity where we could accelerate growth. And we're not opposed to raising a new additional round of capital. But I think right now we have the option to decide with whom and when it would be the best time and at what kind of price, of course.
A kind of last one for me, really. I mean, Sebastian, I'm curious because it has been an interesting but a fairly, dare I say, tortuous journey. It's been, there's been a lot of changes and surprises perhaps along the way. What would you say briefly is perhaps something that you would do very differently now that you've got 6-7 years behind you to reflect on?
It's a really good question. I think the part of the market research is something that we would have done more deeper, gotten more deeper into and really understand the structure of the industry. Something that we now realize that it's key, like for a B2C play, is that the supply side of the marketplace is not as concentrated as what we have seen in the bus space. But even so, like you can create a business where it depends kind of on that type of product, like for the customer acquisition side, and then you're also cross-selling multiple opportunities, which is what we see right now. But I think um, throughout this journey, we've learned a lot, and we are extremely bullish on the market and in Latin America in general. Um, if you look at what is happening in Latin America right now, like even though it's challenging to do businesses, you can create a lot of competitive barriers because of those relationships that you build throughout throughout the journey. And right now, I think Latin America is kind of going through through a lot of change. You have like from like it's a region that historically has had a lot of instability, but from a long-term point of view, you have like a thriving economy and a society. Middle class is going like from 31% to of population in 2010 to 47% in 2025, and it's almost like 640 million people that are moving, that are already kind of moving into the online space. In the case of Mexico, like 60% of the population is banked, and really, I think the winds of like the macroeconomic trends are behind the sales of what we are building to be able to capture a lot of value in the digitalization of this middle class customer, which really travels by bus. And so we're very like bullish on the strategy.
Thank you.
Very cool. I had one that might be slightly off topic, I guess, but I'm going to ask anyways. There's been an interesting surge of super apps in Latin America and Asia. WeChat in Asia was the first one several years ago, but I keep on seeing every rideshare app is trying to be a super app. And what's interesting is that you just talked about LATAM being, moving from being a little more development economy to having a lot more middle class over the last 10 years of the next 5. It's interesting that this trend of kind of 1 or 2 or 3 sites and apps doing everything has happened in these kind of developing economies when there's when it seems like certain brands are able to kind of bring everyone online and capture a lot of value. And I'm curious, if you have any thoughts on that. We're actually, Mozio is having a conference in about 6 days from now, but I think this will have aired after the conference already happens. But and that's actually one of the topics is trends abroad, and it talks about super apps and how various brands are adapting that, and how do you think about that at all when you are building a brand in an economy like that? It's growing in a very different way than someone like Wanderoo or BusBud, which are based in Boston and Montreal.
Correct, and I think the trend of the super app is something that we're monitoring very closely. I think there's multiple cases in Asia that people are kind of tracing, and in Latin America you have already players like Rappi that are following this whole strategy. But I think ultimately for the user, it's very easy to switch from one app, or let's say from one site on their cell phone to another. And I think I'm less bullish on the concept of the super app. I think the consumer will always look for the company that provides like the most convenient and many times the best price for the service that they're looking. And so, it's something that time will tell. But I think we're kind of monitoring the space, and like the main benefit that a super app will have is kind of the recurrence that all of us in the travel space don't have. But yeah, I think it's too early to kind of say how that whole market will end up. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I think that's all from us. Sebastian, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Kevin.
Thanks a lot.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, just to wrap up, this has been How I Got Here, Mozio and PhocusWire's weekly podcast about innovators in travel and transportation. And thanks again, Sebastian. That's it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more insight stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages. And get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.